Right, hello everybody. Today we are going to be doing a very brief review of the adjectives notes. You can find these notes in Google Classroom under the heading S02 Adjectives. This is not going to be a complete walkthrough of all the notes because we have gone through pages 1 to 9 during class time. Instead, this video is going to be more of an overview where I'll go through the information that you need and where you can find it. And for the purpose of today's review video, I've gone ahead and put everything onto one page, which I will make available to you as well. That's a kind of cheat sheet to help you with your studying. So let's begin where we started in our notes. When we're talking about adjectives, we can find adjectives in one of 3 positions in English. And to remember where these positions are, you can use A, P, and P. Okay, app. That'll help you remember the names of the 3 positions of the adjectives. Let's zoom in over here for a moment. And remember, when an adjective appears in the attributive position, this means that the adjective appears before the noun. As an example, we could say, autumn is full of bright, cheerful mornings. Mornings is the noun, and we've got 2 adjectives here. Now, if you can say and between the adjectives, or if you can swap their order around, then we are going to use a comma between the adjectives. For example, we could say, autumn is full of cheerful, bright mornings. There isn't a strict reason for why bright and cheerful need to be in that specific order. They don't fall neatly into the Ossoscomp framework that we discussed in class. Remember, Ossoscomp refers to opinion, then size, then age, then shape, then color, and then origin, ethnicity or nationality, and material, and then purpose. When we're talking about Ossoscomp, M and P, material and purpose, could be words that look like nouns. For example, leather or plastic. These are examples of materials. Both leather and plastic are nouns in English. We can see them, touch them, and feel them. So when the word plastic appears in front of another noun, for example, a plastic toy, plastic is not considered to be a noun. It's part of the adjective group. So it's a modifying noun or an adjective describing the material. All right. We use and when 2 adjectives refer to the same quality. All right. 2 adjectives refer to the same quality. So, for example, if we're talking about an object that has 2 colors, we would say this is a yellow and black insect. This is a yellow and black insect. Both yellow and black refer to color. So we'll use an and between those 2 attributive positioned adjectives. If the adjectives can't be said in a different order, in other words, they follow the Ossoscomp pattern, do not use a comma, but limit yourself to 3 or 4 adjectives and modifying nouns. Okay? In this case, here's my example, the tall black Italian leather boots. Tall refers to size. Black refers to color. Italian refers to origin. And leather is the material. And then boots is the noun. We could say the tall black Italian leather hiking boots. And then hiking would increase the would tell us about the purpose of the boots, right? Because these each fall into their appropriate category in Ossoscomp, we don't use a comma and we don't have to use and. All right? The attributive adjective really only has the function of describing the noun. This is probably the most common position in which to find adjectives, or perhaps the position that you are most familiar with. The second position is the predicative position. Now, underneath the P and predicative, you can see I've included this little page square over here. This tells you where you can find out more information about this position in your notes. So I've included these for each one, for the attributive, for the predicative, and also for the postpositive, so that you can use it as a study aid to make sure that you understand everything in your notes. But let's get back to talking about the predicative position. The predicative position is where the adjective appears after the noun and after a linking verb. What is a linking verb? A linking verb is a verb that connects the description or the adjective to the subject at the beginning of the sentence. And so we could see something like, the flowers were bright yellow. In this example, there are two adjectives, bright and yellow. Now, yellow is an adjective of color, and bright is telling me more about the type of yellow. So we're not going to put a comma between these two adjectives. These two adjectives form one idea. The word for this is cumulative. Bright plus yellow make one idea here, bright yellow. You could also say something like dark brown or light blue. Okay? This doesn't happen very often, but it's especially common when we're talking about colors. So the rule for comma use in the predicative position is to use a comma between all adjectives unless they are cumulative. So that it means unless they stack up to make one idea. Here's an example of a sentence that does not use cumulative adjectives. And I'm going to zoom in a bit more so you can see it clearly. When the princess kissed the frog, he became tall, dark, and handsome. Here we have three different adjectives describing three different ideas. And so we put a comma between them and an and before the final adjective. This is how to use commas and ands with the predicative position. Now, the last point that I make over here is that you must use and before the final adjectives, again, unless the adjectives are cumulative. So the phone case looks dark blue and deep red. Here you can see that I have created two cumulative adjectives, dark blue and deep red. Dark plus blue makes one idea, and deep plus red makes one idea. So I'm going to use and between them because deep red is the final adjective in this string. Okay. Now, what do we use the predicative adjectives for? We can use the predicative adjectives for, under function, subject complements or expressions of measurement. For example, if I said, Dimitri is 195 centimeters tall. Now, 105 centimeters tall is an expression of measurement. You can find out more about this on page 4 of your notes. Lastly, the third and final position is the postpositive. All right? This is where the adjective appears directly after the noun. Directly after the noun. That is the postpositive. The postpositive adjective usually appears directly after the noun with no comma between the noun and the adjective. If you delete the postpositive adjective, in this case, the meaning of the noun will change. So let's have a look at the idea of Secretary General. That is an example of a postpositive adjective. General is the adjective describing the secretary or the type of secretary. Now, if I were to just delete general, that would leave us with the sentence, the secretary was tall. That's a totally different meaning. If I say the Secretary General was tall, the Secretary General is a fancy title for somebody high up in an organization, right? But a Secretary General and a secretary are two totally different things. So the post-positive adjective normally appears after the noun with no comma, all right? And if we delete the adjective, then the noun's meaning will change. However, if there is a comma after the noun, the adjective phrase that follows is extra information about the noun, and the meaning of the noun will not change if you delete that adjective. So I used the quote from Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Raven, to demonstrate this in class. And it begins, once upon a midnight dreary. Once upon a midnight dreary. In this case, dreary is a post-positive adjective, but it is describing midnight. And if I delete dreary, once upon a midnight, the meaning of midnight does not change. Midnight stays exactly the same. All right? It's still midnight. Dreary is just adding some extra information about the midnight. So if you compare these two, you can see how the comma affects the meaning. In the case of Secretary General, a Secretary General is one thing, but general is the adjective. If I delete general, then I'm just left with secretary, and that is not the same meaning as Secretary General. However, once upon a midnight dreary, because there's a comma between midnight and dreary, if I delete that adjective, dreary, once upon a midnight, the meaning doesn't change. I just lose that additional information. Now, occasionally, words that would usually be considered adverbs can be treated like post-positive adjectives. We discussed this in class because there's two ways of interpreting this. All right? There's a form way and a function way. When we consider the function of upstairs, it's functioning like an adverb. It's telling us where the lady is in this example sentence over here. But if we interpret it just by looking at what is written over here according to the form, well, in that case, upstairs directly follows lady and it adds information describing which lady. If I say the noisy lady is bad at singing, it's not the same as the noisy lady upstairs is bad at singing. All right, so in this case, upstairs can be counted as a post-positive adjective. Now, what is the function of the post-positive adjective? Well, often it appears as an object complement. All right, it appears as an object complement. And in class, we spoke about how the object complement is dependent on which verb appears in the sentence. All right, you can go and find out about that in your notes. Importantly, the object complement often describes a change of name or some sort of quality for the object. So, for example, we elected her president. In that case, we're changing the name, and president is a modifying noun playing the role of the object complement. We could also say, I will paint your kitchen green. And if I say, I will paint your kitchen green, well then green is now a color, and it is describing a change in quality of the kitchen. All right? Make sure that you write down any questions that you may have so that you can ask them in class during our question time. Another function for the post-positive adjective is in special titles. These special titles normally come from French or Latin, and these are fixed expressions and cannot be altered. You cannot change a secretary general into a general secretary. It's not going to work. All right? To make a plural from these expressions, you need to make sure that you are making the noun a plural. So Secretary General becomes Secretaries General, not Secretary Generals. Okay? The last use for adjectives is in poetic descriptions. This is what we can see in the example of Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. It is in fact a poem, and so to say Once Upon a Midnight Dreary suits that use. It's a poetic expression, a poem. Okay. Now, more than just adjectives, we have also spoken about complements this semester. Okay? These complements, we've spoken about 3 kinds of complements. So just like there are 3 adjective positions, there are also 3 kinds of complements that we've spoken about. We've already spoken about the subject complement, which is from the predicative position. And we've also spoken about the object complement, which is the post-positive position. The third kind is in fact the adjective complement. And I've put it up here as number 1 because I wanted to just organize the flow of this last column properly. But actually, you can put them in any order you want. There's just 3 of them, okay? Let's talk more about the adjective complement. The adjective complement usually appears after the noun, okay? So anytime you've got an adjective after a noun, for example, in the predicative or the post-positive position, that's where we're most commonly going to find the adjective complement. However, there are a few exceptions to this, and please make sure that you check that out in your notes because the list of words is given. For example, different, similar, or the same. If you consider the sentence, I have the same truck as you. All right? Or they put the same book on the shelf. In that case, we've got the same adjective, but it is before the noun, and then our adjective complement is appearing after the noun. This can happen with any of these expressions here. The second point to remember with adjective complements is that you can expect to find adjective complements along with subject and object complements. All right, they kind of work together here. For example, she was happy to go home. Or his heart grew colder than ice. Or she seemed happy that he left. And he has a heart black as coal. All right, he has a heart black as coal. There we have our little as coal, which is our adjective complement for black. The next point to bear in mind is how to form adjective complements. What do they look like? Well, there are 3 main positions, and I've numbered them and highlighted them here for you just to help you remember them. The first type is to have adjective and preposition and noun or ing word. I am fascinated by science. By science is the adjective complement. I am afraid of falling. Falling, or of falling, is my adjective complement because it uses a preposition and a noun or an ing word. Sometimes you can add an infinitive to this pattern. For example, I am fully invested in learning to speak English. I am fully invested, here's my adjective, and then in learning, here's my preposition and ing form word, but I've got to speak included in the adjective complement. All right, finally, we also have the adjective plus infinitive. Not finally yet, sorry. Secondly, we have the adjective plus infinitive. In this case, we would say something like, I am excited to learn. To learn is the infinitive. All right, it's to plus the basic verb. Many people talk about the to infinitive, but this is technically not correct because the infinitive by itself already contains to. So it's just easier to say infinitive, really. Okay. 2.1, you can add a subject for the infinitive by introducing it with for. Why would the infinitive need a subject? Well, because it's a verb, and every verb could potentially have its own subject. I am excited to learn. In the first example, who is excited? It's I. And who is learning? It's also I. Right? So these two verbs both have the same subject. But in this 2.1 example, I am excited for you to learn. Over here, I am excited, but who is learning? You are learning. All right? This for allows the infinitive to exist later on. If you used a different conjunction there, for example, I am excited because you to learn, that structure is incorrect and it will not work. All right. The third and final case for the adjective complement, the third and final form, is when we have adjective plus a whole new clause. And there's a little Aladdin and Jasmine for you to help you remember that. A whole new clause. This clause would usually be introduced by that. Now, I say usually because it is better to not use that if possible. All right? Check your sentence. Normally, if the clause is very short or very clear, you can just delete that. And it makes your writing a little less clumsy. All right, here is an example. I am glad that I can share this whole new world with you. Okay, I am glad that I can share this whole new world with you. If we delete that, does the sentence become confusing? I am glad I can share this whole new world with you. No, there's no clarity problem, so I would highly recommend deleting that. I would also highly recommend paying attention to the fact that I prefer to delete that because in your exam, I may slip one or two sentences in that do not have that explicitly written in the sentence. Even if there is no that, what follows is still an adjective complement explaining more about the glad in the sentence. All right, guys, this is a complete overview of the adjective notes that we have covered in class so far. I just want to leave you with one additional note. Up here at the top, I say, remember, adjectives and nouns work together with determiners. Those determiners are things that we studied in detail in the first semester. We spent most of the semester talking about our conditional sentences and our determiners. Now, at this point, I expect you to know them. And because this is an English conversation course, you need to be able to use all of those conversational skills that we have been working on. Please keep reviewing those notes. The YouTube videos are all available, and hopefully you'll be able to combine what we learned in the first semester with what we're studying now, so that both in your performance assessment and your final exam, you'll be able to avoid unnecessary mistakes. All right. Well, this was a bit of a shorter video, but hopefully it helps you find your way around the notes. Please remember, write down your questions, pop them into the Discord, and make sure that you ask them on time. If you leave your questions until the very end of the semester, we may not have time to go through all of them. So, especially as we are practicing our public speaking during class over the next few weeks, make sure that you use that time to ask me any questions if you're unsure. Thank you very much. I hope you have a wonderful day. Study hard, and I'll see you soon.